psychedelics are that X factor.
You mentioned we were talking about DMT earlier.
That's a great segue.
Well, here's the reason why I want to say that. There's a really interesting book called What Technology Wants, and it talks about evolution, and it says there's two main camps, and one is the contingency theory, the other is the inevitability theory. One is that contingency. Things just happen because at the moment that's the best tool it had to arrive at a random meandering into whatever direction that billiard ball shot the other one off into. The other one is that everything inevitably is converging towards, like, no matter what, we humans were going to be evolved here, even if you rewound and started over and over again. During the Metazoan period, there's eyes evolved 40 times, I believe, and different kinds of eyes have continually been evolved, and these are immaculate. Even Darwin was just like, there's something interesting about the eye. Anything less out of it, and it wouldn't work as beautifully as it does. So inevitably, what this guy is saying is, in What Technology Wants, awesome book, he's saying that technology is also inevitable. And the way we build it, it's also at a population density, we get to a point where this will always happen, what's happening on the planet right now. And just to finish this off, what I find super interesting is one of the tech hubs of the world, Silicon Valley. What was that area very popular for during the awakening? Haight-Ashbury.
Yeah, the psychedelic trances of the 60s. Jerry Garcia.
And a lot of those people actually went on to being techies. So Timothy Leary, huge into talking about, psychedelics. This is how we turn on a generation. By the end of his life, he was talking about AI and he was talking about future tech. Terrence McKenna was doing the same thing. So I do feel like what you were saying might have a little bit of merit, that most people will be fine, and they are the ones who were herd or group think. Really, they just want to be part of the group. And then there's the outliers. Like you'll find outliers even among, chimps or orangutans, where like they study these chimps and they're like, why are they so depressed? They're always hanging out way outside. And they took these outliers and they studied them, and then they brought them back. And it turns out that their entire tribe were murdered because they're outliers, the ones who were different. They stayed on the outside of the group. They're also the early warning signs of external threats.
Interesting.
And so the interesting thing is, I wonder if there is an X factor, and psychedelics potentially, they seem to be this thing where like there's intelligence in nature. I believe there really is intelligence in nature. Call it just it uses an algorithm to know how to grow towards the sunlight and somehow synergize and harmonize with the mycelium blanket. And it really is this closed loop system that found a way to just survive. There's an algorithm, this very same equation that accounts for the, what is that? Mandelbrot set, that kind of infinity loop that, generator, is the very same equation that accounts for how populations, especially like rabbit populations, they balance themselves. They go to a peak and then they balance themselves. And it's always something. It's some external thing, whether it's a predator or, the environment. Something keeps it in check. It's this closed loop system.
Is that the Fibonacci sequence, the Mandelbrot set?
No.
Different equation?
That's different. Yeah.
Let me tell you something crazy. You mentioned that like the eye was like essentially, some believe it was an inevitability.
Mm-hmm.
Then it stands to reason that if we ever encounter extraterrestrial intelligence, they will look very, very much like us for several reasons. One, we evolved on a planet where we have an oxygen-rich environment, but not too oxygen-rich, which means we have the ability to manipulate fire, which allows us to separate certain elements and create various components. It allows us to create technology. It allows us to refine minerals and ultimately build rocket ships and other technology. An intelligent species, say the dolphin, they're fairly smart. They don't got hands. They're underwater. There's no fire by which to smelt anything, and there's no hands by which to manipulate things. Out of all the life that may exist in the universe, assuming it does, the ones that succeed in developing technology will probably be in a similar environment, or at least in a certain capacity, have the ability to manipulate elements, to create components and advanced technology, and have the ability to manipulate small things. So it's entirely possible that eyes will evolve, the ability to sense the visible spectrum, as we call it, the ability to have some kind of fingertips so that you can use smaller tools and make very refined computers and microchips and things like that. And probably, I would say oxygen makes a lot of sense because the ability to control fire. So they breathe similar things to us. They look particularly different, Who knows what their skin might be like? Maybe their sun is bigger, smaller. Maybe they're further away from it or whatever. Maybe they like certain temperatures. But you look at the boiling point and the freezing point of water, where there's water, there tends to be life. I think they would be extremely similar to humans. Maybe we see symmetry in nature. They may have 2 arms. They may have 4 and no legs, and their arms function, interchangeably, but they'll still be able to use fine tools.
Like they could have a darker star, so they're not as light focused. Maybe they're more receptive to heat, although I don't know if what's more base, heat or light.
Well, you have to think about the freezing point and boiling point of water.
Yeah, hydrogen's pervasive.
They would likely exist in a similar temperature set that we do. Now, I do think it can be a bit simplistic to think that, because there's probably things we haven't discovered yet. There's probably ways by which some species could eventually discover a way to isolate certain elements and develop components without using fire. So based on our current technology, we can make that assumption. They must be in some way similar to our atmosphere or whatever like that. I think that's fair to say. But there was, I believe, in the past 20 years, they used to think the components for life were based on exactly what we were. They're like, oh, here's everything that life has. But they were looking only at Earth. And then there was a revision saying, instead of saying they need water, how about we say there needs to be some kind of base by which chemicals can mix and interchange? It doesn't need to be water. So it could be something else theoretically. But I think it's fair to say, there's a good chance that, assuming there is alien life, and I think the universe is certainly big enough to warrant it, they will actually be fairly similar to us. They won't speak English like they do in the Marvel movies, but like in the Star Trek, show, they're all fairly humanoid. They all look different. They have different heads. It is a little over the top how they all are basically people, but their foreheads are a little different. But you look at some of the alien races and bipedal humanoid type structure, I think there's a decent probability of it. Maybe not a guarantee.
You mentioned the bipedal part. There's symmetry in, just about all organisms, so that symmetry is very interesting because to produce 2 of everything, it helps the way we move and orient to gravity. But it also is like DNA can be more efficient. Just repeat the same thing on the other side, mirror it. And so they go into that. And they also speak about contingency and inevitability. It's not one or the other. It's yes and. Contingency, you were saying how maybe they found another way to get to a point that we did. Maybe they made jumps and strides. And their main point in the book is that technology is the main thing that does that. We have this contingency where it's it usually happens very slow, but technology, it can make huge strides because something else, very intelligent is working on giving it those. It can jump a bunch of generations that we had to go through in the slow way. So contingency is the way that it happens, and inevitability is where it's going. I know I'm going to California, but how I get there, that's dependent upon the roads and the traffic.
You want to know what else is a very large component that will, I believe there's a likelihood that, assuming there is extraterrestrial intelligence, they will be similar to us, not identical, but they will also be a very warlike species. The reason for it is war is natural competition between the intelligent. A war between humans and deer ends very predictably. Hunters go out in hunting season and sweep the fields and wipe out what they call pests. A lot of deer no longer exist. However, humans up against humans means that when one human develops gunpowder, the other human has to quickly adapt. And because they're intelligent, the conflict goes from being between species to between different tribes within the same species. That conflict results in a rapid development of technology. Because if you don't compete successfully with the new arms and the new weapons, you die and you get wiped out. So you take a look at Europe, for instance, and the proximity of all these warring countries and the rapid development of their technology. That war drove a lot of technological advancement, resulting in a lot of things people probably take for granted. Space program had a lot to do with the Cold War, and we developed a lot of new technologies. Plastics, for instance, were heavily influenced, I think, with the space race, trying to find lighter and stronger materials. And now we reap the benefits of that. Any other species, I should slow down a little bit. Many other species in a different planet, if they're living freely and peacefully, say Avatar, the movie Avatar? Mm-hmm. That actually was particularly intelligent. They weren't very advanced. They had bows and arrows. And I know it's probably just a movie cliche that they're trying to make them look like Native Americans or indigenous population, as primitive. But the reality is, based on their world, where they could all communicate with different species, that would present less of an opportunity for conflict. because they weren't a particularly warlike species and were very, pro-nature, they didn't develop a lot of these technologies. So I'm not an expert on this stuff. I'm not an anthropologist or anything, but I was reading about why it is that the various tribes of Native Americans in North America weren't as advanced as, say, Europeans in terms of gunpowder and ships. And it's because the North America was so massive that when a conflict would arise, certain tribes could just leave.
Yep.
And so there was an opportunity to escape as opposed to fight. And when given the opportunity, most living beings choose no conflict. So even a grizzly bear, they don't want to fight you. If you're threatening their children, they might. If they're starving, they might. But in Europe, where it was settled for a long time, and you had basically people pushed to the edges, I'm going to war with you and taking what you got or else. And then they just became very competitive. Whereas the Native Americans were like, yes, there was a lot of war. Absolutely. But a lot of tribes could just be like, we better get out of here. It's better to run than fight.
Then maybe it's possible we're only warlike because we're all stuck on this planet with nowhere to run. And if we were able to spread out infinitely, that we would let go of that.
Like Star Trek. The Federation becomes much less warlike. And most of in the show, the Enterprise is a science vessel. It does have military capabilities because you got to defend yourself from threats, and there is war. But yeah, I guess the issue is when you look at, say, the movie Avatar and these imaginations of what a species would be like if they didn't have conflict, why would we have any reason to develop the technology if we're comfortable and peaceful?
Right. You need to create the conflict within yourself. Why I like psychedelics. If you've ever taken psychedelics, you have to face yourself, the natural conflict of nature. The what have I done wrong? Maybe that's will keep us building and creating if we force ourselves to work the muscle of the mind.
In psychedelics, it is a technology. It's just the way we use it. It is a technology. Shamanism is a technology, and there's a very accurate point to this. When you take psychedelics, what I believe the main thing that you're doing is you're amplifying the here and the now, the set and setting that you're around. Your mindset is being amplified. All of your emotions, your subconscious is being amplified. It's shown that those, the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, the neocortex, all the filters between them, they go. So your subconscious is emerging. And then so shamanic tribes, what they would do is they would have some kind of a rattle, and they would get like a rhythm going. And then they would sing, they would use the voice. And there's something about the melody and the rhythm and the use of song, which they say they got from the plants. That's a technology that destabilizes what's called the default mode network. And that's where they say the ego lies.
Let's talk about this extended state DMT stuff. So we had Alex Jones and Michael Malice on this show, and a lot of talk about DMT.
And gorillas.
And gorillas, that's right. And Ishmael, which Ian has right there.
Thank you very much.
Somebody sent us that.
For those that aren't
Josh for sending me a copy of Ishmael.
For those that aren't familiar, the meme "I am a gorilla," which we sell the shirt. Go to timcast.com, click shop, and you get your "I am a gorilla" t-shirt. It's based off of Alex Jones saying this book Ishmael is a psychic gorilla telling people that they're destroying the planet. And so Alex kept saying, "I'm a gorilla," and then the gorilla emoji happened, and then we made the shirt as a joke, but we have the book. So anyway, in this conversation we were having, there was talk of the elves breaking through the veil. You take DMT and you take enough, you blast off. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about this conversation, the thing that really, excites me is this idea. There's been studies where people had shared experiences. They all take DMT. And you'd think if the drug was an internal chemical effect on your brain, well, then everyone's brain's going to be different. But people reported seeing basically the same things. Now, these trips are limited. But you were telling me, Ben, about extended state DMT. What's going on with this?
So if any of your listeners know Dr. Rick Strassman, he wrote DMT, the spirit molecule. What he did was there was a long prohibition on psychedelics, and then he was the first in the U.S. to break through that prohibition. And he basically just said, I want to inject people with high amounts of DMT and see what happens. It was very, very simple. And they were like, all right, approved. Broke through that. So they injected them in a clinical setting with high amounts of DMT, and these people would have the very same acceleration. There's this crescendo, and then you blast through some kind of what can only be described as like an other dimensional or at least a psychological barrier, and you blast through into another world.
The veil.
The veil. And so the interesting thing was, in a lot of people who speak about this, there's hundreds of thousands of trip reports, or at least many, many thousands, I should say, of trip reports of people saying, when you get to this world, it's not just a distortion of this world. It's not just like you're seeing pink elephants in the road, but the road is this world. You seem to be in a completely different place, but it's structured. It's not just very weird and amorphous. It's very structured, and the beings that you meet there, the people come back and say, like, listen, I've done ayahuasca, I've done, peyote, I've done mushrooms. You meet different things, and I can't tell if it's just part of my own psyche, but in the DMT space, this was not me. This was absolutely not me. They're very, very intelligent. A lot of the times they're insectoid. Sometimes they call them machine elves or clockwork elves. They have mechanical aspects to them, short, very small, sometimes very weird. Joe Rogan talks about it a lot, but they fall into certain categories. So there is some kind of like repetition or like an archetype to what people experience in this realm.
Michael Malice said they're like slinkies. Like they're made of like a wireframe spiraling kind of structure of some sort.
I've heard of that. I've heard they're like elves made of like, tin cans and sometimes like trash, sometimes crystals. But there's really only a few categories. It's not like, I saw, like this actor or, whatever, like a 3,000 foot Bigfoot. They usually fall within the same categories. And the interesting thing about this is that the extended state DMT, so I just did a film called DMT Quest, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But DMT Quest is all about endogenous DMT, which means we produce DMT inside of our own brain, and we haven't known why. It's very interesting. Like, it's there all the time. It's being produced throughout the brain in far higher amounts than we originally thought. There was a bunch of people that said, yeah, but it's not enough to make enough sense of it. But we show in DMT Quest with John Chavez, the founder of it, that it's being produced about how much serotonin and dopamine we have in the brain. That's how much DMT we're making. It's comparable levels. So the interesting thing is like we know it's already in there. Maybe it's a part of how we see reality, how we experience reality. Rick Strassman said everybody who comes back from a mega dose of DMT, they say whatever that was more real than this real. That felt more real than this. And that's something that happened over and over again. And these volunteers, they weren't talking to one another.
So the people who took the DMT said the place they went to felt more like reality.
Mm-hmm. It felt more familiar. It felt more real. And it's just more real than real. That felt more real than this real. And that was a lot of people saying that. So this, now compounded on, this was in the 90s, Dr. Rick Strassman was doing this. So now there's this awesome guy, Anton Bilton. He's the one who funded DMT Quest, and he also is the one who funded Imperial College London to do extended state DMT. Basically, that's taking, I think it's called the Henry Boyle machine. It's like an anesthesiology machine where it's a continuous infusion into your bloodstream now of DMT. And it has already started. So I don't know, yes, they're gathering data, but it's probably not going to be out for a couple of years. It takes a while for it to come out. But just imagine. So the reason why they're doing this is because DMT is very fast acting. They call it the lunchman's psychedelic because you can go to lunch, do DMT, and when you're back, there's no real afterglow. It's not like, oh man, I need to take a day off. You're just back. You're 100% back, but with like a what the, like that's how you're feeling afterwards.
So when these people were doing these very deep trips, blasting off, could they interact with the real world? Could they like sit up and be like, hey, yo, I'm not feeling too well. Can you get me out of this chair? Or were they just like zonked out?
It's a good question. Could they? Maybe. So theoretically, I've done it. And theoretically, I've gotten up in the middle of it. So can you? Yes. Do you want to? No. It's more interesting in there. It's not interesting to be in this world while you're having that experience. You want to just kind of stay super chill, low light. It can get very aggravating, a lot of light, a lot of noise. So your set and setting, it has to hold the space for you to be wherever you are.
So like sensory deprivation.
Some people have done that.
That sounds trippy. Super trippy.
Literally. Aubrey Marcus just did, I forget how, 6 days in complete darkness, and you start having almost DMT-like visuals in that kind of respect.
Yeah.
So you could probably compound it like that. But imagine this, Imperial College London. They're doing extended state DMT. Why? Because 15 minutes in that space is not enough, and we need to talk to whatever these beings are.
Oh, dude.
So this is a major university that's like, well, there's so much anecdotal evidence. We need to figure out what's going on in that space, because what if these actually are interdimensional beings that are here? We just never see it because the veil is here. We see a small sliver of the light spectrum.
All of a sudden, you start to understand what Alex Jones was trying to say on Joe Rogan when he was yelling about the interdimensional beings and all this stuff going on. And you're like, what are you talking about? It's like
crazy.
You slow down and you explain people do DMT. They experience something that is fairly shared among people. And that is what really makes me say, like, I want to know what this is. Because when I hear people talk about ghosts, I remember there's like a coffee shop by me when I was a little kid, and they were like, oh, it's haunted. Someone once got pushed down the stairs. And I'm like, dude, I'm more likely to believe someone pushed them down the stairs, and it wasn't a ghost who pushed them down the stairs. It was someone who didn't like them. You know what I mean? But when you tell me that a university put a bunch of people in a chair, shot them full of DMT, and they all had a very, very similar experience, I have two thoughts. One, I think it's reasonable that maybe it's just because we're all human that our brains react the same way, creating a similar experience. Or perhaps there's something more to it. Maybe we're shattering through this veil and we're seeing something beyond reality that truly does exist. Before people realized there was a charged electromagnetic spectrum, they did not know it existed or could even fathom what it was. And then we were like, hey, yo, guess what? Radio waves. Now we can communicate by just like a signal being sent out with electromagnetic pulses.
What I really love about this is that you guys are saying they keep experiencing the same type of things. Either it's mechanical, insectoid, you said beings of light sometimes, or small creatures like elvish things. So it is possible there are species throughout the universe that have evolved, and one of them was an insectoid species, one of them was a small hominid one of them was a mechanical society that is like an advanced AI, and one is just pure light that is conscious, that's possible.
What if this has happened over and over and over again? And when we're talking about inevitability, like, what if it's inevitable that we explore, maybe it's not always called psychedelics, but it's inevitable that we explore beyond the veil of our own limitation. And that's what evolution is we realize there's actually something universal that we're all connected to. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious. Some call it the Akash. I don't know how much I even understand about those terms, but what if it is inevitable that breaking out of what's called the default mode network, all psychedelics do that. And the default mode network it's consuming like 50 to 60% of all of our biological energy, at least in our brain, when we're just ruminating and daydreaming. It's some say it's not efficient. Maybe it does serve a purpose, but psychedelics break you out of that. And this is how people are saying psychedelics are helping people with intractable depression, anxiety, things like eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress, TBI. There's like Unlimited Sciences is a group out of Boulder who basically brought up to the UFC, because there's so much traumatic brain injury, that psilocybin mushrooms, potentially working with Johns Hopkins University, is saying, like, we need to actually dose some of these fighters with psilocybin because it's helping neurogenesis. They're regrowing brain patterns back. Low doses of DMT actually help for stroke. So imagine, DMT might be actually really, really important in the brain. We just don't know why yet. So we're sitting here speculating on it. We're all on DMT, by the way. Everyone in here and everyone listening, we're all on DMT. It's just sub-psychedelic.
You mean like naturally occurring in our brains.
Occurring endogenous DMT.
We don't want to give the kids the impression that we all smoke.
No, you're definitely right
It would be
about
a different show if that
Yeah,
was.
Very different, very different.
all plants, all
Check
mammals.
this out. What if we were talking before about, MMORPG reality? Is this existence full of billions of humans who are all sentient, conscious entities? Are only some people conscious entities? Or is it only you listening to this show? What if this experience people are having where they say it's more real than reality? What if that's just like when you're not playing the game? So have you guys you've seen the Rick and Morty episode where they go to Blitz and Chits, I think it's called, and he plays the game called Roy, and he basically puts on this headset and then lives a full life as a guy named Roy, and then he loses when he's like in his old age, gets crushed by a carpet, and then all of a sudden he like comes back to the game, the arcade, and he's like, wait, who am I? I'm Morty. Like, what if that's what it is? What if the reality is you're not really blasting off, like you are, but you're not really breaking through. It's just like you're temporarily looking back at the real world where you're playing this video game that is humans on Earth. Thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. If you want to see the full show, come back to this channel, youtube.com/TimcastIRL, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., where you can leave comments and super chat, and we actually will read your comments on the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you want exclusive members-only content, segments you can't get anywhere else, go to timcast.com, become a member, and we even have full bonus episodes. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.